To raise this money, Lord Grenville, the first Lord of the Treasury, asked Parliament to pass legislation to reform the administration of colonial finances and to impose new taxes. In 1764, Parliament enacted the Sugar Act that levied new tariffs on imports into the colonies of foreign textiles, wines, coffee, indigo, and sugar. This measure also lowered the tax on molasses imported from the French West Indies, which the colonists used to distill rum, an important trade item. Traditionally, the colonists had evaded the high taxes on French molasses by smuggling or bribing royal officials. Grenville believed that with a lower tax, colonists would be more likely to obey the law and simply pay the customs duties. At the same time, he sought to reform the entire system for collecting these import taxes. Grenville ordered the customs service to tighten up its operations. The government had already given the customs service tools to help them in this objective. One was the ability to use writs of assistance. These documents enabled customs collectors to search anywhere they wished without having a specific warrant. Colonists affected by this measure were alarmed at what they saw as a violation of their rights as British citizens. The second measure was the right to try customs cases before vice admiralty courts. Colonial juries were often sympathetic to smugglers and often refused to convict them of violating the Navigation Acts. Vice admiralty courts, on the other hand, had no juries, only a judge appointed by the Crown. The British government figured, correctly, that they are more likely to get convictions in these courts, but the colonists saw it as a violation of the traditional British right to trial by a jury of their peers. Parliament also sought to pass on more of the costs of maintaining an army in the colonies with the Quartering Act of 1765, which required any colony in which troops were stationed to pay for their living quarters and food. This law particularly affected New York, which hosted a large contingent of royal troops. The New York Assembly refused to pay, protesting that it was unfair to ask them to bear the burden for troops that were supposed to be protecting all the colonies. Outraged by this refusal, Parliament ultimately sought to punish the colony by suspending the Assembly until it complied, which it did in 1769. While the colonists were upset by these measures, it was the Stamp Act of 1765 that really set off a crisis. This measure placed a tax on documents and paper goods. Every newspaper, pamphlet, contract, license, and deed had to have affixed to it a special stamp that proved that the tax had been paid. Violators would be tried in juryless vice admiralty courts. This measure represented the first attempt by the British government to impose a direct tax upon the colonists. Customs duties were considered external or indirect taxes, primarily designed to regulate trade rather than raise revenue. For hundreds of years it had been a basic principle of British government that only Parliament, as a body representing the people, could authorize taxation. In 1689, in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, the king had signed a document referred to as the English Bill of Rights, which affirmed this right. The colonists argued that since they did not elect any members of Parliament, they were not actually represented in this body, and it could not tax them. Their perspective was reinforced by the fact that for 150 years they had only been taxed by their local elected assemblies. The British rejected this argument, declaring that all Englishmen were virtually represented by Parliament, regardless of whether they actually voted for its members. This reflected the reality of English politics, where only a small percentage of the people had the right to vote. In the colonies, however, the widespread availability of land ensured that most adult white males met the property requirements for voting. The debate over actual versus virtual representation became a key issue in the events leading up to the Revolution, and the slogan, "No taxation without representation," a catchphrase of the emerging American resistance. Several of the colonial assemblies quickly issued protests against this new tax. The most eloquent protest came from the Virginia House of Burgesses. Inspired by the rhetoric of Patrick Henry, they passed what became known as the Virginia Resolves. They affirmed that the colonists had all the rights of Englishmen, and that taxation should be in the hands of local governments, which were closest to the people. The streets of colonial cities were rocked by popular protests. In Boston, angry mobs hung an effigy of the man appointed to be the local stamp tax collector, and then destroyed his house, and the house of Thomas Hutchinson, the Chief Justice of Massachusetts. Gradually, an organized revolutionary movement began to emerge, giving itself the name the Sons of Liberty. It was led by colonial elites like Sam Adams, but its ranks were filled with ordinary citizens, like those who had rioted against the Stamp Act. The development of this intercolonial organization indicated that the colonists were increasingly thinking themselves as Americans, not just citizens of their individual colonies. This trend was encouraged by the use of committees of correspondence, voluntary associations founded in the various colonies, which corresponded with each other to ensure that news was passed quickly throughout the colonies. Americans also sought to put economic pressure on the British government. Hundreds of merchants in colonial cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia signed agreements to boycott British goods. Ultimately, representatives of 9 colonies met in the Stamp Act Congress. The Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which asserted that since the colonists were not directly represented in Parliament, it could not legislate for them or impose taxes. The Declaration also condemned the use of Vice Admiralty courts, which they believed violated the right of all Englishmen to a trial by a jury of their peers. Back in England, Parliament was shocked by what many saw as treasonous behavior, but the colonists had made it clear that they would not accept this tax. The British government was also under terrific pressure from English merchants, who were alarmed by the American threats of economic boycott. Reluctantly, Parliament withdrew the stamp tax, but at the same time defiantly passed a new measure, the Declaratory Act, which stated that while it had chosen to withdraw this tax, it still had the power to legislate for the colonies in all matters, including taxation. Indeed, just 1 year later, Charles Townshend, the new chief financial minister, sought once again to raise revenue from the colonies. Recognizing that Americans would not accept a direct tax, he instead imposed indirect taxes in the form of tariffs on a variety of goods, including tea, glass, lead, and paper. These acts affirmed the use of writs of assistance and created 3 new Vice Admiralty courts to enforce these regulations. Traditionally, the colonists had accepted the right of the British government to regulate their trade through tariffs, taxes on imports. In the wake of the Stamp Act crisis, however, the Americans viewed these tariffs with new eyes. They argued that they had only accepted the right of Parliament to raise import taxes to regulate trade, not to raise revenue. They were also deeply alarmed by Townshend's proposal to use money from these customs duties to pay royal officials in the colonies. Governors, judges, and other bureaucrats appointed by the Crown had always been paid by local assemblies, giving the colonists considerable leverage over these officials. The effort to pay them directly was clearly meant to curb the power of colonial governments and enhance the ability of the British government to enforce its decisions. Once again, the colonies responded angrily. Customs collectors were attacked, and merchants once again signed non-importation agreements. This economic boycott was enforced by the Sons of Liberty, who sought to shame and punish merchants who failed to comply, and by the Daughters of Liberty, who vowed to purchase no British goods for their families. The Daughters of Liberty also supported the boycott by expanding the production of homespun cloth to replace British textiles. The British government decided to deal firmly with the colonists by sending additional troops to Massachusetts, which was at the center of the brewing conflict. The increasing presence of royal soldiers simply agitated the colonists even more. These tensions famously exploded in 1770 with a clash between citizens of Boston and a British patrol that left 5 colonists dead. Colonial agitators like Sam Adams quickly seized upon this event as evidence of British tyranny, dubbing it the Boston Massacre. Many colonists saw this as evidence of what they had feared all along, that the British had placed an army in the colonies to intimidate and bully them. Ultimately, 9 of the soldiers involved were tried by a colonial court, which found 2 of them guilty of manslaughter. The turmoil in the colonies and the economic boycott forced the British government to once again retreat. In April of 1770, they withdrew all the new tariffs, save one, the import tax on tea. This they kept as a symbolic gesture of their right to legislate for the colonies. For a while, the conflict seemed to subside, but 2 events helped to reignite colonial passions.